is Rod Butler, city manager of Yarupa Valley. He's been city manager at Yarupa Valley for 4 years, past city manager in four California cities, an MA from CSU, Long Beach, and probably most important, a BA in political science from UCR. Second is Scott Ochoa. He is city manager of Ontario. He's been the city manager for 8 years, past city managers in Monrovia and Glendale, a graduate of Claremont McKenna College, and has an MB from USC. Third is Juan Perez. Uh, uh, his official title is the Chief Operating Officer for the county of Riverside. He has been with the county some 23 years. And just for the audience, if you're somewhat unsure what a chief operating officer is, this is Juan Perez's description. Working in partnership with 25 elected or appointed department heads, I provide operational support to the county CEO through overseeing the constituent services operation of Riverside County government. My duties include collaborating with our elected sheriff and district attorney, other public safety partners such as fire, probation, public defender, and emergency management, our human services portfolio, our public works, community services portfolio, and economic development, and the registrar of voters. And the last, joining us, a colleague of Rod Butler is Joe Perez. He's been with Yarupa Valley for 3.5 years, now assistant city manager, came as community development director, which he has been from four past Southern California cities. He's a graduate from UCLA. With that, let's welcome the panelists, and again, thanks for joining, and look forward to the conversation this afternoon. This is the first question. You've all received the questions, and in no particular order. Whoever wants to start, and maybe we might have an interchange after each question. Question number one is, when making decisions related to the development of the warehousing and logistics industry, what are the major factors to consider, and how do you decide the trade-offs between different priorities? In particular, there are many negative impacts that have been brought up by different parties and local residents. What are the strategies to handle these challenges? Opening question.
Seeing as I think I turned my mic off first, or turned it on, I'll start us off. For Ontario, it's interesting because we're 50 square miles, so a rather large city in terms of land area, and we have an entire area that was developed over the city's 130 years as a heavy industrial base. That is to the southeast of what we call the old model colony. Basically, most of the land that's north of Riverside Drive, north of the 60 freeway. And then we have the additional 8,200 acres that were incorporated into the city in the 1990s, that has been come to be known as Ontario Ranch. And so as we examined the opportunity for industrial in that area to the south, we have a unique, and I think a positive, helpful, beneficial attribute in the sense of that size and in the age of the community. So all of our new industrial, for the most part, the big warehousing and logistics industrial that you hear so much about, is in that new area of Ontario Ranch. And specifically speaking, it's towards the southwest of the city, and that area, by and large, is still the old ag preserve. There isn't any residential there for the most part today. And then, as you've seen infill development, what I think you've seen as the airport has come back to local control and the rise of e-commerce, is our ability to do infill redevelopment with a little r, because the state has taken us out of the redevelopment game by statute, in replacing older, dirtier, heavier industrial with lighter logistics and goods movement types of warehousing operations. And so we've seen this metamorphosis go on. And as we look at those decision factors, it really kind of comes down to good urban planning and allowing a master plan that was devised after the incorporation of the ranch into the city to really be followed and be followed faithfully. And so you're seeing that play out in real time and in real terms today. I know, sometimes it still becomes somewhat controversial from the standpoint of every new warehouse is something that sparks some degree of controversy. But I think if you step back and look at the broader perspective, you see that it works in our city, and I, will freely admit that it probably works as a function of the geographic size of the city and then the age of the city by way of those infill projects.
It's good, thank you. Maybe we go to Rupa Valley and to Rod and to Joe.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, just kind of feeding off of what Scott said, we're in a different situation in Rupa Valley because we've only been an incorporated city since 2011, July of 2011. So many projects, including many logistics, warehousing projects, were already built and approved and then built during the time when we were just an unincorporated part of Riverside County. So we have some legacy projects in that whole sector that are now part of our incorporated city limits. And similar to Scott, we're a pretty large city, about 44 to 45 square miles in our incorporated city limits. But then we've also had some new projects that have come in the logistics warehousing sector during the years that we have been incorporated. So it's kind of that dealing with and living with and adjusting to what was approved before we were a city, and then also trying to do the best job we can of evaluating projects that have come in the years since we've been incorporated. A couple of things that we've done specifically on the policy front that I think we can possibly talk about a little more in detail as the discussion goes on this afternoon. The city adopted its first general plan in 2017. So that was really the first opportunity for the community to look at where we wanted industrial and logistics and warehousing development to happen within the city. An outgrowth to that was two what we call overlay zones. So there are two areas of the city. One would be the kind of the northwest part of the city, actually borders Ontario, the Miraloma area. So there's a Miraloma overlay zone in which logistics, warehousing, distribution projects can be built. And then now we have in the northeast part of the city, Rubidoux area, what we call the Agua Mansa industrial logistics overlay. So again, northeast part of the city. Those are the two cities right now where large logistics, warehousing projects can be built. And then more recently, following the overlay zones, Joe and his team put together what we call our truck intensive uses ordinance. So that was an ordinance that went through the whole planning commission process, approved by the city council, taking an even more detailed, granular look at truck intensive uses and where those should and can be located within the city. So
Rod, could you maybe clarify what a truck intensive use plan is?
Sure. And I see that Joe has joined us now. Joe's our community development director. He was intimately involved in the development of that ordinance. So maybe you can handle that one, Joe.
Sure. Yeah. And just before I move into that, just an added piece of information. Rod's absolutely right. I think just want to focus a little bit on those overlay areas. Those are in our general plan. So the kind of the long and short of it is, if anyone wanted to come into the city and operate or construct a new warehouse, logistics, distribution use, they would have to, if they did not fall within one of those two areas within the city, then they would need to get a general plan amendment, and that's a big deal. So that is, that's CEQA is involved, public hearings before the Planning Commission, and then public hearings before the City Council. So it is no easy feat to actually just come in and have a new logistical operation in the city. Those would require general plan amendments. Those are well-defined areas. Those can be expanded and have been expanded under very, very limited circumstances. And usually those, when those happen, those are in coordination, or they include, I should say, a development agreement, which includes community benefits to offset those negative impacts that any logistics or warehousing might have or would have in any particular area. So those overlay areas are sort of the most, I would say, most important features that we have and tools in the city to really keep a limited focus on where you can have those types of uses. But yeah, so in addition to that, as Rod indicated, we had actually, it was a moratorium that we had on truck intensive uses in the city. And those types of uses really are not just warehouse logistics uses, but those could be contractor storage yards, equipment sales and storage, cold storage, smaller warehouses, even some uses that you might not think are necessarily truck generators, but even shopping markets can actually generate truck traffic. So what we did is we took a step back and we said, well, what are these types of uses and where do they make sense? So we defined the size where such uses could go. So for instance, 1 acre or less. We defined the size of these buildings, which would be like 30,000 square feet or less. They would have to have a certain distance requirement from sensitive uses such as schools and churches and residential areas. And then we would require an extra layer of entitlement review. So instead of it being, let's say, an administrative review, something like a site development permit or something that would be done by staff, it would require something like a conditional use permit. So it would be public, there would be a public hearing, there would be public noticing, CEQA would be initiated and complied with. And so those are the sorts of things that we did to not just address the larger warehouse distribution, but also just uses that did generate truck traffic, might have impacts on our residential or more sensitive use areas. And it was very, very well received by the public as well as by the council, which ultimately adopted that ordinance.
If someone was interested, they could write to City Hall and you would send them a copy of the report?
Absolutely. We would make our staff reports, of course, available, as well as our PowerPoints, which summarize it. So if they didn't want to read through a lot of documents, so we'd be happy to make that available, of course.
Why don't we then go to somebody who has more than 50 square miles to worry about? One, as you look at the county and try to deal with this question of warehousing and logistics, how do you frame it?
Thank you, Professor Leverage. And first of all, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining, and thanks to UCR for hosting the forum. And a little bit of context for me, prior to my current role in the executive office, my background has been in transportation and land use planning for the county over the last 20 years or so, like 23 years. So for the county, it is done at a very large scale. We are 7,300 square miles of county. The unincorporated area is smaller than that, maybe 46,100 or so, somewhere in that range, square miles. But certainly it's trying to do planning at a very large level across 70 plus unincorporated communities. So we do that by looking at a number of things as to what factors we consider. I think similar to some of the comments you heard from the other panelists, it starts by looking at land use compatibility and the land use, general plan, land use and zoning designations in an area, and what those may call for. certainly going through a process, an extensive process of studying environmental impacts and potential mitigation of those through CEQA, through the appropriate level of environmental studies. And certainly community input and public input is an important part of that as our policymakers look to ultimately make policy decisions on projects. Some of the resources and tools that the county has enacted over the years to help focus on this industry is looking at good neighbor policy. We actually adopted one back in 2019, I believe, so going on about 5 years. In fact, I think it's actually been a model as well, cited by other sources, including the state attorney general in their review in this area. So we look at that for things like best practices for site design, for buffering, for landscaping, for the elements that are important as far as, parking, truck routing, electric charging of vehicles, what have you, all those type of things go into those reviews. We do certainly also look at opportunities and the appropriateness of community benefit contributions. We started a number of years ago in an area of the county, kind of looking at it from additional contributions to offset air quality impacts, which led in that particular case to the establishment of a community benefit fund for that area, which just over time has actually led to things like tree planting, for example, in that community. And we're continuing to expand the review of that. And as part of our future review of our general plan elements, different aspects of it, we'll look for those as well. So including in the environmental justice arena, and looking at the appropriateness of that. So it's a lot of different factors, and certainly it is a very public process, and it goes through policy discussion to try to achieve that right balance, and ultimately for our policymakers to have the information to make the best decisions possible.
On the same question, if someone wanted a copy of the Good Neighborhood guidelines, that they would contact the CEO's office, or?
Absolutely, they can reach out to myself or to our planning department or transportation land management agency. We'd be happy to share that. I suspect they're online, and we can provide the link.
Okay. Any as you listen, any further comments that anyone has on before we get to more specific questions on warehousing logistics? Okay, well, let's go to the second question. That was that in terms of city finance, discuss the pros and cons of warehousing industrial uses, for example, tax revenues, provision of city service needs, and some of this gets to the point that Juan made, but I think is becoming increasingly important, that is different kinds of community benefits.
Juan, do you want to jump in first?
Sure, happy to. Thank you. So certainly, as we look at county over the last 10 years or so, we have seen significant growth in our property tax. We have seen significant growth in our sales tax, particularly our what we call Prop 172, there's a public safety sales tax component. And some portion of that is attributed to logistics growth. I can't point to a specific figure today, but I know, but we have certainly seen that over time. And of course, those revenues are what allow us as public agencies to provide backbone services to our constituents. So those are considerations. We have also seen growth in jobs in transportation and warehousing over that time, and some growth on wages also in transportation and warehousing over that times. over that time, and those are continue to evolve. And on the service side, again, it can be very site specific, and certainly there are exceptions to it. But generally on the service side, don't see generally as much of a provision, a requirement for services, with exceptions. And I will mention about exceptions. Certainly the things that we look at for impacts are on the transportation network. And I know we see those, particularly from truck traffic. So that is, if I would point to one impact on the service side, it is that. So we look at ways to try to address that and mitigate that through appropriate mechanisms, including development impact fee structures, other mechanisms as specific projects move forward to help offset the service impact. So a little bit of a snapshot of the different considerations at the macro level.
Juan, on traffic, do you work with the RCTC in terms of projects? And
so we have actually multi-layered, if you will, fee structures. We work with, depending on the region, for Riverside County and Western County, we work with WRCOG, and for West County on our transportation unit for mitigation fee. We work with CVAG out in the Coachella Valley, similarly as well, and those are development fees that are across several jurisdictions, across their 28 cities, whether it's in Western County or Eastern County. But beyond that, the county also has our own development impact fee structure for the unincorporated area. And I should mention, and I think it's probably known, but again, just to stress that the county's land use authority is only within the unincorporated areas. And that's where we would apply our fee structure for development to come forward.
okay. Let's continue in reverse order, Rod.
Sure, thank you. I'll kind of zero in on one of the topics that Juan mentioned, and it's a topic that I think gets forgotten or may not be completely understood in the bigger discussion about logistics and economic impacts and financial impacts, and that's sales tax revenue. Sales tax is by far our number one general fund revenue in Jurupa Valley, and that's true for a lot of California cities now. But what a lot of people don't realize is that these logistics, warehousing, fulfillment center buildings can be huge generators of sales tax revenue for cities or counties if that location is used as a point of sale. So for example, in Jurupa Valley, one of our largest sales tax generators currently is the Costco distribution fulfillment center that's based in the Mira Loma area of Jurupa Valley. And that's because they fulfill a lot of online, Costco.com orders out of that facility. Jurupa Valley is used as the point of sale. So I think if you looked at our top 25 sales tax generators in Jurupa Valley right now, there are probably at least 6 or 7 of those that would be considered, quote unquote, warehouses or logistics buildings. And it's because those companies are using those facilities as point of sale locations for reporting sales tax. So that's something that we have directly benefited from in Jurupa Valley. Juan also mentioned property tax, and we in Jurupa Valley, for the last assessor's report, which I think was the 22-23 property tax roll, Jurupa Valley had one of the largest percentage increases in our assessed valuation as a city. And that was partly the result of the completion of a large warehouse distribution building in what's called the Agua Mansa Commerce Park. It's over in the Rubidoux area. It's the site of the old Riverside cement plant, which Riverside old timers will remember, right there on Rubidoux Boulevard. It provided concrete for some of the largest public works projects in Southern California for many years, but it was a old, vacated, kind of dilapidated property for a number of years. And that has now been purchased and is being redeveloped as a new state-of-the-art fulfillment center warehouse property by CT Realty out of Newport Beach. And just the completion of their first building, they'll have 4 or 5 buildings there by the time it's all done. But that provided a nice property tax boost for us just based on the assessed valuation of that one building. So, I know it's a complicated issue and there are impacts that would be considered negative or challenging as well from logistics and warehousing. But from a city manager standpoint, we also see the positive side of property tax and sales tax revenue generation from some of these buildings, and especially if there is point of sale activity going on out of that particular building from online sales.
Do you recruit warehouses that have that kind of sale? I imagine the city, that'd be fairly competitive.
Yeah, we have not done any sales tax sharing agreements. A lot of cities have been very out in front with recruiting point of sale locations for, especially in industrial or warehouse buildings, and they will actually do sales tax sharing, which is still legal and appropriate in California now. We haven't done any of that, but we certainly do work closely with the developers of these business parks to try to do anything we can to encourage their tenants to be point of sale generators for us, because that, in addition to the property tax benefit, that can be very, very lucrative for the city from a sales tax standpoint.
Yeah, Joe, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I really, this is a great discussion. One of the things I'd like to circle back on are two things. One of the things that we talk about when we're talking to potential users of warehouses is the city does not have what's called the utility users tax. This is a very common revenue generating source among municipalities, and it's usually on a percentage basis for things like water and electricity and gas and so forth. So whereas a user may come in, they're gonna actually calculate that amount when they're coming into a particular city. That's not something that the city charges, so that gives us somewhat of a competitive advantage. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. And then the other thing, just circling back on the community benefit agreements, I cannot tell you or overemphasize how important that is from a revenue generating standpoint for the city of Jurupa Valley. It creates not only short-term revenue, infusion into the city, but also ongoing revenue streams to address very specific impacts in the community. So, for example, we had a situation where we had a very large project that consisted of about 250 acres. It's a true like a mixed-use project. It includes regional retail shopping. It includes hotels, open space, residential, but it also included a very controversial component, which was a 1 million square foot warehouse distribution center. And so we had to look at the offsets. What are the benefits of all of the great, stuff that cities love to see in terms of retail, but you have to offset the impacts of potential warehousing, which we're talking about pollution, we're talking about truck traffic. These types of uses tend to not generate a lot of jobs for the square footage. So that's what makes them worrisome to communities. And so you can address those concerns in these community benefit agreements or development agreements. And so, for instance, what we did is we said, okay, developer, you need to, there were a lot of concerns by the community. So there's pollution. Well, we want to make sure that the vehicles aren't traveling through residential streets. We want to make sure that in the development agreement that the developer has to provide air filtration systems to residential homes. And these are existing homes. These aren't new homes. We want to make sure that they're providing infusion of money that the city can bank on to provide upgrades to facade improvements to existing businesses who are worried that the new businesses might drive them out of business. Community financing district dollars that can go toward an ongoing revenue stream for public safety services and for maintenance of roads in particular. So we've been able to build in those requirements in our community benefit districts to address very specific needs in the community. I'm just giving an example of a few, but the list goes on. And so it's really important that when you have warehouse distribution coming in, you need to anticipate what the impacts might be and how you can offset those, how you can mitigate those, not only from a very practical standpoint, but also from a political standpoint, to address where the pressure points are, where the council may be pressured and into addressing. And so you want to anticipate those, and then again, build in terms within your development agreements or community benefit agreements that directly mitigate those impacts. So that's just, again, I can't tell you how important that's been for the city in terms of making it not only acceptable from a political standpoint, but also really makes sense financially. It does infuse a lot of dollars into the city to provide critical services. So yeah, that's what I have to add. Thank you.
Community benefits have increased over time, do cities share with each other the kind of community benefits they receive from warehouse development?
Yeah, those are public documents, so we have a good sense of what other cities are doing, and also just we have a history of it, so we've just gotten better over time in terms of seeing, well, what are other cities doing, what have we been doing, what makes sense. One of the things that we've done as a new executive team is, and I think this is important for two reasons, but what we've done is we've brought on a third party consultant to help us analyze. Developers will make all sorts of claims in terms of what they can afford, what's financially feasible, and so forth. So it's always good to have a third-party consultant that the developer pays for, but works for the city to analyze their numbers. So it gives us a sense of assurance that that what we're asking for is reasonable, and maybe sometimes it's not enough. And it also allows for credibility when we go to the city council, because we as a staff can say, hey, we've looked at these numbers, we feel comfortable with these terms. And by the way, this third party consultant, they're experts in this area, they also believe that. And that just creates a lot of credibility once you get to planning commission and city council hearings that can be controversial and contentious. So that's very helpful.
Thanks. Scott, Ontario in many ways is sort of the model success story of logistic and warehousing. What kind of thoughts and recommendations would you make?
The theme of all of my comments today on this topic really revolves around this concept of balance and discipline. And so, to the extent that we have a plan that was well thought out, and that we do our best to execute it faithfully, I think that it starts with that. When we start looking at decision factors that emanate from financial considerations, from the revenue side of the house, I mean, on the one hand, it would be, we try to avoid of looking everything from a fiscalization of land use perspective. But from a realistic perspective, you have to take that into account as to what certain land uses will generate, what certain land uses will cost, and what ultimately is the destiny of the community that you're driving towards. So when we look at warehouses, much the same as we look at any other commercial or industrial non-residential type of use, we will apply everything that you've heard thus far. We'll look at what the property tax generation is. We get 16.5 cents on the dollar. That is high compared to some cities. My experience in LA County, it's relatively low. Certainly lower than the cities that I've worked for in my career, but it's high for out here in the Inland Empire. And what that is, that increase over what the base is today, if it's new development down in Ontario Ranch, that is a pretty significant leap in what that assessed valuation is and what it translates into terms of property tax. But even in the built out part of the city, where we have some of these old economically obsolete buildings that are being repurposed, or not even the building, but the land itself is being repurposed, being able to reset that base under Prop 13 and start to have a more level playing field among those non-residential land uses is critically important. As Rod points out, sales tax dwarfs property tax in the city of Ontario. And some of that is our brick and mortar businesses like the Ontario Mills and other types of retail outlets that we have. But a good, respectable chunk of it also is point of sale on these distribution centers. And so, we look at recruiting those businesses, and we have a number of them. Some of them do demand a tax sharing agreement, particularly those who we might be in competition with, not so much other cities, but certainly other states. And we see a lot of competition from Arizona and Southern Nevada, outside of Vegas. And so, we try to discern between what we do with those types of users and what we do with others, where, for example, a couple of our most prominent sales tax generators from the warehouse side of the house do not have sales tax sharing agreements. So it really is a unique and perspective, and not something that one size fits all. Other revenue considerations are the fees for service. That all of the permits that come across the building and planning and engineering development counters, and looking at how that impacts the community. And then I would echo what you've heard from my colleagues here in terms of community benefit districts and community facility districts. We have a CFD for facilities. We have a CFD for services. That helps ensure that the new development does not come forward in town at the expense of the existing development, of the existing residents and businesses, and that folks are paying their fair share. That's been immensely helpful to us. I think the only other thing that I would add beyond that, when it comes to this discussion about the benefits, particularly the economic benefits, is trying to apply a strategic lens to each marginal next project that you're developing, particularly as it pertains to infrastructure development. So if you have a economic or a industrial type of project, a warehouse project, or series of projects that will bring the most expensive elements of your infrastructure, your water, your sewer, your storm drain, your recycled water lines, if they are able, because of the economic value of that land use in this particular economic cycle in this market, well, what ultimately that does, what we have found and what we've capitalized on, is to allow that to pave the way for future development. So it may look like it is an industrial play for the city, but in fact, it's also a residential play and a mixed use play and a quality of life play for the city, because by these industrial developers, these warehouse developers bringing that infrastructure, we're paving the way for folks to come forward, acquire properties, clear it, clean it, and then be able to do much needed housing for the region and for the community. And along the way, through either CFDs or through other investments by the city directly, be able to install the kinds of quality of life amenities that offset for our community, we believe, the impacts of that warehouse development. A 300-acre grand park that runs from one side of the city to the other, a 200-acre sports complex that also has economic development components or features for it. And so the idea is to take everything in this broader perspective, apply tactical lessons project by project, ensuring that each project is better than the last, and at the same time simultaneously look at it from a strategic lens and say, okay, what is the overall mosaic looking like, not just the one tile that you're laying?
Well, that's really a lead into the third question, and I think the most difficult question to answer, and that is this question, and let me just read it. What strategies would you recommend to address the future growth of inland localities with warehousing development in mind? Is regional planning of the development possible? And if so, how? If not, why not? In terms of land use, in terms of alternative choices of housing, we tend to approve each development one at a time. Should there be some cumulative look at traffic and related impacts? Cities want to do their own thing, but maybe start with Scott and finish with the county on this, which is in some ways a regional authority. Scott, what do you think about future growth and some kind of regional planning?
Again, I go back to this balance and discipline. I can tell you, Ontario City Council had been approached earlier in my tenure here about raising the line from Eucalyptus Avenue, which is the east-west street that is the northern boundary of that industrial sector for the new warehousing district, and raising that up to Ontario Ranch Road. And it was difficult for the council because they are big believers in following the market and adhering to what the market dictates. But their adherence to good planning and a commitment to the ultimate master plan led them to say, no, we will keep that line at Eucalyptus. Certainly, until and unless you can figure out whatever the environmental impacts are for trucking and for traffic and for congestion and what have you. How do you get containers to and from the airport in a way that, and to the rail lines in a way that is not going to negatively impact the existing community? And they adhered to that. They had the discipline to adhere to that. And I think it speaks to that part of your question, Dr. Leverage, that if there's a temptation to look at each project only on its own in a vacuum, I think that's a recipe for disaster. I think you have to be willing to step back and look at the larger picture and start to assess what those cumulative impacts are. Now, as cities, we have those types of tools by way of our general plan adherence, a disciplined adherence to the housing element policies of the state, which are aggressive, and embracing of what the regional housing needs assessment dictates are by way of the housing units that you would facilitate, and not treating them as simply exercises and boxes to be checked, but rather guiding planning principles that keep us in balance, that keep in equilibrium. And that helps give the council confidence to continue moving forward. On the regional perspective, certainly I would defer to my colleague from the county, but I think that he probably would agree that it sounds great to say we will have a regional master plan among independent cities. But I think the realpolitik of it, without being overly cynical, is that you have elected officials who were elected by a mandate of their constituents, be it at large or by district. And they have a belief in what they are there to do. For them, and for me, for that matter, agenda is not a four-letter word. And they have an agenda that they are pressing forward on. Trying to herd those cats, 5 council members over X number of cities, over certain parts of a region, that is much more difficult than what it sounds from my experience. It would be great if we could adhere to it, but in practice, it's extraordinarily difficult. I dare say nearly impossible.
Rod.
Yeah, thanks. I think Scott does a good job of describing some of the challenges of making a regional approach work. We do try. We are actively involved in, I think Juan mentioned it earlier, Western Riverside Council of Governments, which is a regional body that does a lot of important things, and it at least helps us stay in touch with what other cities are doing. But again, it's not necessarily getting involved in micromanaging land use decisions in particular cities. We also, and Scott's been a leader in this, the city managers of what we call the Interstate 15 corridor cities. So you're talking Corona, Norco, Eastvale, Harupa Valley, Ontario, Rancho Cucamonga, and Fontana. So cross counties, 2 different counties, but all touching Interstate 15. We have just recently started a cooperative group, again, not necessarily designed on micromanaging land use decisions in each city, but at least trying to build relationships and awareness among those 6 or 7 cities that are right along the Interstate 15 corridor. And an example of that, not necessarily warehousing and logistics related, but Rancho Cucamonga has been a leader in the whole Brightline high-speed rail project, Las Vegas to Rancho Cucamonga. And this forum has given us an opportunity to at least understand and learn more about what that could mean to the cities along the Interstate 15 corridor. So I think you're starting to see the seeds of some regional cooperation, working on issues of transportation, and maybe eventually at least looking at how our land use decisions are impacting each other. But like Scott says, it is challenging to make that work in a way that we would have some kind of a regional strict plan for logistics development or warehousing or really any other kind of development.
Is the Interstate 15 effort both electeds and staff?
Right now, just staff. Yeah, the city managers have kind of taken leadership in that. Scott's hosted one of the meetings, and Eastvale hosted our first meeting. But we feel like at least that's a start to begin integrating at the staff level and building relationships there.
On this question of regional planning, it often look to the county and say, what are the counties are doing? Your thought about warehouse logistics growth, which is occurring in both counties, need for housing, economic development, et cetera. Where do you come out?
Well, I think Scott and Rod really covered it well. I don't see the dynamics changing as far as the land use process. Local control is very much embedded, if you will, I think into the DNA of just about every local agency that I've ever worked with or for the reasons that Scott mentioned. It's ultimately the elected officials that have to answer to their constituents. So. Where I do see opportunities, and we're seeing them, but there are certainly more opportunities available, and that we need to keep working on together at the regional level is on areas, and Rod touched on some of these, transportation, because certainly the impacts cut across boundaries. Air quality, I think, is another area that there are opportunities, and I'll talk about a couple of things going on in that area. And I will also say workforce. Workforce is another area. There's opportunities for regional collaboration as well. I think on the I think forums and work such as the work being done by CSERT, for example, and UCR, looking at initiatives like the OSAR consortium, looking at onboard sensing analysis and reporting. That looks at tracking emission measurement and reporting to have a better data, better information for air quality impacts. The Speaks training sheet program that looks at STEM focused opportunities for our workforce to train them in the industry. And I think it's important also to look at opportunities to continue to lead to upward economic mobility in the industry. Certainly the logistics jobs themselves, but also continue to look at opportunities, whether it's at the corporate or otherwise, in the logistics sector and other opportunities for economic upward mobility. I think those are important. Working with the colleges and universities on workforce training and our various different programs that our colleges and universities enact to look at training that workforce of the future. So I think those are all opportunities for collaboration at the regional level to lead to greater sharing of knowledge, of information, of best practices, of understanding of impacts at the regional level, because those things certainly have impacts at the regional level when you're talking about transportation and air quality and so forth. But also recognizing the importance at the, I'll say, micro siting level of local control and the enactment of each county or city's land use element and policies and consideration of projects.
Do you see WRCOG and CVAG helpful in these objectives you identified on?
Yeah, very much so. I think regional governments can have played and can continue to play an important role in that to bring for us in our county. We have 28 cities as well as a county. So the forums for those conversations, Rod mentioned discussions around the 15 quarter. I think those are so important. And I think, and I will say just kind of looking over the span of my career, I do see a lot more cooperation and conversation and collaboration between individual cities and cities working together with the county and counties working together as well, that we have in the past. So I think there's been greater awareness of the harnessing that power of conversation and dialogue and coming together and look at issues more holistically.
We're getting near 5 o'clock, and let me, by way of closing, this is not on the list, but if maybe you could close with a question. If we look out that over the next 5 years, Juan began to do that. What do you see happening in terms of this logistics and warehousing in the next 5 years? I don't know. Let's maybe reverse the order again. Scott, do you want to?
So much is up in the air. It's uncertain. Retail behavior changed dramatically, obviously, with the pandemic, and that gave what perhaps was an artificial spike in warehouse and logistics types of industries. But what you're seeing now are behaviors as people are comfortable going back and purchasing experiences and being around other people. You're seeing some normalization of that retail behavior. I don't know that things will ever go back to the way they were before the pandemic, because I think they were changing anyway. But there will be an equilibrium that we find. I think what you'll continue to examine in terms of land use as it pertains to warehousing are what are the strategic nodes of distribution networks, and I think that will guide what the future is going to be. We have an airport, we have 2 freight lines, we have 3 freeways. My guess is that Ontario will remain a center of the logistics industry for some time to come. If for other cities that identify those kinds of geographic fixed assets that would contribute to an inland port or whatever the case might be, they too will have those same opportunities. If you are building in this space just because everyone else is building in this space, because you looked at each transaction, each project just as a separate standalone type of use, my guess is that will not survive very long, or at least maintain its intended use as it was originally developed. I think that's where the future probably goes in this area. And so it's important that we make sure that we have that balance, we have that discipline when it comes to this type of development.
Rod, we're looking ahead 5 years. Where are we going?
Yeah, I'll mention 3 quick things. I think you'll see, just because of the realities of available land in the Inland Empire, you'll see the activity moving to the east. And again, it's just a function of a lot of the large parcels in the western part of Riverside and San Bernardino counties, being built out now. And I think more concern in some of the communities about allowing additional logistics and warehousing. So I think you'll see, the Beaumonts, and we're already starting to see that, in fact, communities in the high desert. You'll see a movement of a lot of the new activity out there to the desert regions. I guess it would be a better way to say it. Number 2 would be, I think, a more of an emphasis on making logistics and warehousing buildings environmentally more sensitive to environmental concerns than they have been. Some of that will come from environmental justice advocates and regulations at the state and county and AQMD level. But it will also come, I think, from the developers themselves wanting to, understanding the concern about climate change, concern about effects and impacts of these facilities on sensitive uses around them. And so things like making preparations for electrification of a lot of the truck fleet. That's a specific example. So yeah, I think you'll see greater sensitivity in that area. And then 3rd would be, you'll see cities getting more sophisticated with their demands and their execution on community benefit agreements and their negotiations for those benefits. It's going to be, I think there's an awareness now that you can get real tangible positive benefits, financial and otherwise, for your community if you're going to allow these developments in your community. And therefore, why not take advantage of that and use your increasing leverage to negotiate good development agreements that contain those things. So those are just a few specific thoughts.
3 excellent points. Joe, do you want to contradict your boss or to add to it, or is
I think it was brilliantly said by Rod Butler, my boss. Yes, absolutely, and Scott as well. I think they're both 100% totally in agreement.
Juan, you add another 5 years to the 22 that you've been in Riverside County. Where do you see us going in the next 5 years?
Yeah, it's certainly I agree. I think with everything Scott and Rod have said about the emphasis on the areas that haven't developed and are more infill, and certainly greater view on those and what's appropriate there and how our impacts mitigated, those types of challenges. Also, continuing to look at some movement further east, if you will, along transportation corridors, and we're seeing some interest in some areas further east as a result of build out. Certainly, at the end of the day, a lot of this is driven by consumer habits, and while we continue to, this industry has evolved due to online habits, if you will, and will that continue? Will there be more of a shift back to some of the brick and mortar and creating the spaces for commercial use, for not just commercial use, but all the other benefits of coming together as communities. So all those things remain to be seen. And I think I will also add another one, which is one that will continue to face is what impact will automation have on things, and how will that shift the landscape in the future. So all those things remain to be seen. And I think just speaks to the need to continue collaborative discussions like we're having here today.
Dr. Leverage, I mean, can I just by that, I think that there's some really good points from Juan and Rod and Joe, but I think there's questions that we're going to have, right? So, for example, if we're talking about environmental impacts as it pertains to built-out communities today, and the easy answer is to push such uses further east, what's the environmental impact of putting those distribution centers further and further away, and then increasing truck and rail traffic to those far off locations versus somewhere in for those last mile types of destinations? We have to reconcile those types of trade-offs. There was a question in the chat about labor. This is a very interesting dynamic. Whenever we have a warehouse building or warehouse project come before the council, carpenters unions show up en masse because it's a prevailing wage job for the most part. It's commercial construction. You have a bunch of union carpenters stand up. When it comes to actually occupying the building, however, in terms of the laborers, the folks that work inside of the building, once it's open, once it's operational, if those folks are not unionized, you see some of the labor movement getting agitated about that. Will there be a move in California to unionize warehouse labor? That'll be an interesting discussion. And then Juan makes a great point about automation. We have a 4 million square foot building for Amazon here in town that is automated. That's a canary in the coal mine, both in terms of being vertical, so it's several stories, and maybe we economize on the footprint, but then it also has this element of new technology. Will that change the profile of the local labor market? So it isn't necessarily the folks who are working in the warehouses today, because those jobs would be automated out. Some of those jobs would be automated out. But what about the folks that are designing and repairing and working on those automated systems? How will that impact the local labor market? And will we be able to meet that market demand if you see this trend continue? So there's, I think, a lot of questions that we have.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for your time, your comments, your explanations. just personally, I mean, you see the value of people talking about these things and sharing and listening. And so speaking on behalf of myself, the School of Public Policy, the Inland Center for Sustainable Development, thank you. These are, as you know, are not simply going to disappear into the mist. They'll be part of recorded, and they'll be available for others to see. And I think this was an important hour to me, and so thanks. This is like well done. With that, it's a little after 5 o'clock. Thank you, and I encourage you to come to the conference, which will be in the fall, where we try to look at solutions. Thanks very much.